It's essential not only to our mental health and well-being, but to our survival. So my parents named me Brian thinking it was a unique name. Now, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, you know that is not to be true. I was one of 3 Brians in 5 houses on my street, one of 5 Brians in a 1-block radius. There were so many Brians that it was very convenient for every mother in the neighborhood to just come out on their front porch and yell, "Brian," and we all knew that it was time to go home, whether they had a Brian in their house or not. There were a lot of Brians in my neighborhood, and they have followed me throughout my life. As a child, it seemed like I grew up in a very close-knit community where everyone knew each other. But reflecting on that community as an adult, I realized the connections that most of the adults had were based around children playing together. Very rarely did I see my parents out talking to another parent unless it was about something that the Bryans had done. Not me, of course, I was an angel. But as a parent of 2 children, I completely understand. I live in a similar community now where children are outside playing all the time. My kids are outside playing with their friends all the time, but I haven't spoken to another adult in our neighborhood in well over a month, other than the courteous wave to acknowledge they exist. I have not had an intellectual conversation with anybody in our neighborhood. I know nothing that is going on in their lives right now. I couldn't tell you what they're dealing with. We just wave. It's very easy to, even when we live in neighborhoods with an active and vibrant community, to be isolated, to feel isolated, to be disconnected. Recent studies have shown that there is a growing sense of loneliness and isolation in the U.S. A recent study by Cigna Health indicates that 62% of employed adults consider themselves lonely. And these are folks that go into the office and work with folks 8 hours a day. They find themselves being lonely. Now, that may have something to do with the remote culture that we work in now and working remotely, but I think this precedes that. And for those that do not work, who are currently unemployed or retired, that number is even greater, that sense of loneliness. Furthermore, we are seeing rising numbers of individuals reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression throughout the U.S. Depression and anxiety are really interesting behavioral health conditions because they themselves are isolating. What do I mean by that? Symptoms of depression and anxiety make you feel like you are isolated. And when you feel isolated, you have less energy to go out and be with other people, causing you to feel more and more isolated, and you get caught up in this vicious cycle of isolation where you feel isolated and in fact are isolated because of the very things that are going on in your brain. It's a vicious cycle, and it can lead to extraordinary loneliness in our world. Many have attributed this rise of loneliness and isolation to COVID. And although the pandemic certainly has played a role, the increase in depression and anxiety has been occurring for really well over the past 50 years. Now, this may be because of improvements in diagnosing or decrease in stigma related to behavioral health issues, an increase in self-reporting from patients, and just general knowledge of the community, but is also likely connected to diminishing connections between people themselves. I read an article once about the impact of the introduction of central air conditioning and how it has impacted our communities. Now, although it has made living in places like Texas bearable, maybe comfortable, certainly necessary, It has also changed the very way we interact with one another in community. We leave our homes, we step into our cars that are air conditioned, we drive to our offices that are air conditioned, sit in seats in air conditioned, hop into our cars and drive back to air conditioned homes in the evening, never having stepped foot out into the world around us. We can literally go from door to door to door, never contacting another person. If we park in attached garages, it's very possible we won't even see anybody in our neighborhood. If you look around in neighborhoods, you can see houses built in the 30s have expansive front porches that people used to go and sit on. And around the 40s, 50s, 60s, those front porches went away. Air conditioning has changed how we interact. We no longer sit on our front porches sharing iced tea and lemonade with our neighbors. We just go inside. It's a strange world where something as good and as wonderful and as necessary as AC can change the very way we interact with one another and create a sense of isolation. Add to that the advent of television, the advent of the internet, the advent of social media, all devices intended to make us feel more connected and connect us better with the world, and yet, ironically, they do exactly the opposite. Is it any wonder we are experiencing an epidemic of isolation and loneliness? Is it any wonder that we feel completely alone at times? How often do you go to work? How often do you come home and barely speak to another person, even in your household? As we all pull out our phones and stare at the comforting glow that is the technology that we have on us at all times. Something that's made to make us feel like we are more connected, but in fact makes us feel, as Kevin so astutely pointed out, so disconnected from the very people we are trying to connect with. We long for meaningful connections, and yet we as a people are unable to find it. One of the reasons that the early church grew so quickly was it met the needs of the community around it. Early churches not only fed starving people, housed homeless people, provided medical care for the sick and compassionate care for the dying. They did it as a community, in community. You sat at the table with one another. You shared in a meal with one another. You housed together as a community. It was not, here we are pouring pity onto those around us. We are bringing them in and celebrating life with them, attending to their needs with them, attending to our own needs as a community. When Paul speaks of suffering in this world, he truly means suffering because the world around him was suffering. He is speaking to the people who are on the fringes of society, who are feeling isolated and alone because they are isolated and alone. And yet, they come together under this place called the church and celebrate community together. Paul's letter to the church in Rome is interesting because he writes to a church that he has not founded. Churches he is not really connected to. Many of these churches were Jewish communities that had embraced Jesus as the Messiah. They were communities of faith wrestling with what the coming of Christ means for their Jewish traditions. And also, how do they interact with this Gentile community, us, that surrounded them? Paul's letter to the Roman churches centers around the place and application of the Mosaic law within the Christian community in the Gentile community. And what results is this complex theological argument that many scholars believe is one of the most comprehensive depictions of Paul's theological understanding as he himself wrestles with his Jewishness and his Christianity. It's a letter about who belongs in this thing called Christianity and how that community lives together as Christians. And though this is an interesting theological argument, the fact is that Jewish dietary laws have little relevance for people who are starving. The fact is that the rules that they follow, the theological beliefs that they hold to be unequivocal truths, matter very little if they are not creating a place where the suffering can come together and experience the kingdom of God in community with one another. Our society today is much more affluent than the early churches. That's not to say that there are not community or people in our communities that are starving, that are homeless, that are sick and dying. There are. And we as a community of faith have an obligation to provide for them. But we also live in a society plagued by elements of isolation. How many of us truly know the person sitting next to us right now? How many of us truly know what's going on in our neighbors' lives, our next door neighbors, the person who literally share a lawn with us? Do we know what they're struggling with? Do we know what they're feeling? I guarantee that there are people in this room right now who feel completely alone in their struggles, who feel isolated from others, even as they sit in this community of faith. We worship a God who not only created a complex universe that is beyond our understanding, but who also loves each and every one of us as his very own, who has shown us true love time and time again and has presented us with a message of hope and belonging that the world truly needs to hear. A God who longs to bring us into connection with God's self, but also in connection with one another, who has built us as a people who need to be in community. It's essential not only to our mental health and well-being, but to our survival. And he's given us a community of faith in which to share in one another's journey through this life, to support one another, to care for one another. By simply focusing on one another, acknowledging one another, caring for one another, supporting one another, we as a community of faith can address one of the greatest needs our society has at this moment, to create a place where all belong and remind one another that we are never, ever alone.